of our last session will be forthcoming from Mossad Bialik, and he's begun work on another book on the Italian author Primo Levi. And if you're looking for a place to publish, he is currently co-editor of Ode Ta'ed L'Sifudo L'Teoria, which is published by Tel Aviv University. The title of his talk today is Oedipus in the Mamara, War, Family, and Unequal Masculinities, a topic which will tie into the Yael's paper from the previous panel, I am sure. So it is my pleasure to now introduce Ori, who will give us a PowerPoint. Not much of a PowerPoint.
All Men Are Equal, but on a more Shavim is a brilliant novel that broke new ground in Hebrew literature. It is not the first. Shimon Balas's fellow Iraqi communist published his novel Amabara, The Transit Camp, almost a decade ago. While Balas was certainly writing in Hebrew literature, Sami began writing Hebrew literature that is Mizrahi, not only in the biography and content, but in the way said literature engaged the fundamental figures of Hebrew literature. Oedipus in the Transit Camp, as written in Sami Michael's first novel, offers a reconfiguration of the Oedipal figure from the Western Ashkenazi violent rebellion against the father to a Mizrahi form of Oedipus in Clonus, Oedipus in the colony, standing with Antigone against the polis, reclaiming the father. More Equal tells the story of David along two lines. One, a coming-of-age story of sorts, leading from Baghdad to the transit camp, into work, marriage, divorce, unemployment, and war. The war story begins on the 2nd of June, 1967, and spans the 10th days until the beginning of the war on the 6th, when David's unit is hit and he is injured. Both timelines meet at a ceremony when David receives a Medal of Honor for saving his fellows. It is an elegant modernist structure that recognizes the power relations and terms of acceptance to Israeli society, but does not necessarily assert them. The closure of the novel can suggest some form of redemption along Zionist lines, from rejection to acceptance, yet the redemptive frame is constantly undone by an opposite perspective. Colonial duplicity is implied here, but its paradigm shifts. Such a double perspective is an artistic achievement of this novel and of others, as we've heard before. And it constantly exposes the reader's prejudices, the way the other is known in ways the self remains unknowable. The bulk of the story is about immigration and life in the transit camp and beyond. As they arrive in the Chiria transit camp, the family buckles. The father goes blind, and then both parents die in a fire. David is left with his elder brother, the 1956 war hero Shaul, and an otherwise weak familial man. The biblical reference is clear, but the brothers collaborate rather than compete. Both study and manage to advance in society. Shaul never marries, but fathers a child with Naima, who is married to the sellout Knesset member Reuven. And David leaves his marriage to the Ashkenazi Magdalene, and his son perhaps become her lover. The novel has received some critical attention, and those that have written about it are sitting here, so I, of course, am not doing justice to what they have written. Nancy Berg was the first to lay out the details of the text and its importance into the nascent field. Doni Ben Chaviv read the novel in a post-colonial key, heavily based on Fanon, finding that the novel figuratively positions immigration as a trial of masculinity that reflects on Mizrahi women who are delegated to a subservient position in the hierarchy of desire. Bate Shimoni has suggested that the story of immigration is the recollection of David as he goes to war, and that his actions in it amount to a choice of the Jewish identity over the Arab one. For me, the child of a so-called mixed marriage, the book and its title held an ambivalent truth denied by my father and easily recognized by me. As I go through the copy of my book inherited from my Mizrahi fathers, who shares many attributes with David, I see that his comments support the parts that trace a narrative of progress and emancipation into Zionism, but are blind to the warning they come with. His commentary on the text, written in the margins in small, unassuming characters, recognizes the elements of progress available to a Mizrahi man: military service, education, and an Ashkenazi wife, bravely denying the defeat ingrained in their embrace. The story of David engages the canonical Ashkenazi story of immigration and becoming a soldier, challenging universal literature, the peculiar universalism for Jews that is Zionism, to recognize its Ashkenazi particularity. In his Hebrew debut, Sami defied the view common also among scholars that he himself or his characters are motivated by a split, self or otherwise imposed, between a Jewish and Arab identity. In the end, both immigration and becoming a soldier are not an expressive choice, as in the Ashkenazi Zionist story, but an unwilled movement, but rather an unwilled movement ending in the fulfillment of a stable identity under changing circumstances. That is fulfillment, not it is fulfillment of something which is there, not a choice of something that has to be of options. Hybrids and hyphens are not a form of consciousness, but of its analysis. David has an identity that remains intact against the forces ripping it apart. In other words, the post-colonial paradigm, while insightful, also discounts and almost disregards the unity of the Mizrahi subject, repeating the colonial practice of overdetermination based on external attributes. More Equal is a Mizrahi novel in content, no doubt, but in form it is Occidental, and as such has been paradigmatically misread, like most Mizrahi literature, as an iteration of the Oedipal question of Zionist masculinity. More Equal does not easily conform to the Oedipal figure that characterizes Zionist Ashkenazi literature, nor is it obsessed with masculinity and power in the same manner. At least in its beginning, in the transit camp, Sami defies the Ashkenazi psychoanalytical form and offers an alternative view of masculinity, the nation, and fatherhood. In the Ashkenazi form, the father's weakness or strength is what needs to be overcome to become a man. Oedipus is a figure of passage into culture, or a symbolic order required for functioning masculinity. Daniel Boyarin's on heroic conduct has taught us that Freud's development of the Oedipal complex has everything to do with the denial of homosexuality of the Gentiles attributed to Jews in Europe. Deleuze in the Anti-Oedipus shows that Oedipus is a figure of the family as a repressive mechanism serving the state. Oedipus the Ashkenazi is therefore a figure of overcoming powerlessness, a national drama of unstable masculinity leading to the following formulation. Oedipus is an Occidental complex, and in Jewish terms it amounts to an identification with the aggressor against the father's weakness and a resolution to take power. Hebrew literature has constantly narrated this form of conflict as a Zionist plot leading towards independence and the state. In many ways, or even in every possible way, the state generation, Dor Medina, is precisely that, Oedipus in power. The family, then, is key to the interpretation of the novel. Shaul and David present divergent models of absorbing immigration. Absorbing the immigration, not the other way around. The patriarch's downfall is very quick. On the plane, he still holds some prestige because his son is already in Israel and serving in the army. But upon arrival, he is broken by immigration and the discovery that he belonged to an inferior race. In the interest of brevity, this is the quote. You all know it, but you can read it. Abu Shaul and David are readily open to the kind of reading Yochai Oppenheimer employs of positive and negative resolution of the Oedipal complex. According to such a reading, the demise of the father at the hands of the state emasculates the brothers, only for them to establish their manhood in battle. Indeed, at first, the father's weakness draws anger from David, but guided by Shaul, he turns anger into ambition. The father's blindness turns the figure, positioning him as Oedipus in Cronus or Tiresias, reluctant to answer Oedipus's question. It also turns Oedipus around, since it reveals that Oedipus is not his father's killer, and he learns from Shaul to accept the father. David, like Oedipus, searches for the killer of the father king, but his search is not about overcoming the father or finding the killer that stands in plain sight, but how not to become or join this symbolic killer. The Hebrew Oedipus is a figure of becoming or overcoming the father, his political theology, in favor of a Zionist one. The rebellion against the father propels the Zionist subject from Europe to Palestine and makes him a man. Through labor, agricultural labor, and war. As Glusman and others have shown, it is also a corporeal question, reconfiguring the Jewish body as a Zionist man. It is also a generational matter, and we seem to forget that the parallel Ashkenazi generation of David and Shaul fought in the War of Independence and dominated Israeli culture. Sami Michael adheres to the reigning military paradigm of Hebrew literature by emulating the security style. I haven't explained that well. Ensconcing the story of immigration within the story of war, while rejecting its underlying assumptions. Military service in the novel is not contemplated as a choice, though it does offer a supportive environment and is less racialized than the transit camp. Military service and David's conduct in war are part of Shaul's way of being, one that accepts the state as a defense mechanism of the Jews. Shaul's form of pragmatism does not challenge the real power of the state, only refuses to identify with its symbolic power. War has conditioned most Jewish lives in Israel, but more so the life of immigrants from Arab countries. Still, it is anything but a choice. There is no return, at least no immediate return, from the way war forces simplicity on complicated, polymorphous identities. David goes to war contemplating bitterly that the enemy is not his, and yet he saves his unit as a matter of instinct. I would suggest that war does not involve a choice, which is lost in immigration and conscription. Rather, it is a realization of David's Jewishness and masculinity. Perhaps I'm oversimplifying, but unstable masculinity does not seek to be part of the Oedipal figure in the Ma'abala. It is the Ashkenazi Oedipus that needs to become a man. David and Shaul's masculinity is stable, and the fear of castration is mostly of the symbolic kind. It follows that much of the hypermasculinity and patriarchy that is habitually attributed to the Mizrahi men are a reflection of the true nature of Ashkenazi culture. In terms of the body, it stands contrary to Ashkenazi Zionism, where the body is designed and imagined. Mizrahi masculinity is already coherent, and all that is left then is to endow it with shame for not being white. More equal is a subtle work, appearing to embrace Zionist culture and its view of Mizrahi immigrants and the opportunities of emancipation they are presented with, while constantly undoing such an interpretation. This becomes evident in the Oedipal figure when by the end of the novel both David and Shaul have fathered biological sons while abdicating from the symbolic role of father. David, no doubt, is an Oedipus of sorts, and the nexus of all effective bonds in the novel. His quest for knowledge is also a quest for power. David is quick to recognize the father's downfall, but he's neither its cause nor eventually its avenger. At first, the conquest of Margalit is precisely the colonial desire that Fanon describes. Clearly, there's a part in her that represents the very system and gaze that undid the father and turns David into a Mizrahi subject. But Margalit is also of a double nature. On the one hand, she's simply the person in love with David. On the other, she is part of white hegemony, even in choosing David. her symbolic conquest is already a reinforcement of a repressive system. Margalit's mother, Tzipora, is a mother figure of repressive whiteness. She is responsible for hygiene in the transit camp and conceived by David to be his major opponent. The more David succeeds according to her set of values, the more alienated he feels. As an antidote to the venom that Tzipora injected into our lives, I found myself cultivating an enormous desire, insatiable to advance according to her standards, meaning finding a more important job, earning more money, and adopting a moral position that is different and totally alien to the ones my brother Shaul bequeathed me. The inner flame he had lit in my consciousness was dying, and instead grew the lethal desire to succeed. Tzipora's venom is not her white distaste for David's blackness, but rather the way in which she thinks he can overcome it. David easily falls into her trap, and the more he succeeds, the more he becomes insecure, leading him to an impulsive, yet coherent divorce from Margalit. Shaul appears to offer a different moral outlook. Having arrived in Israel before the transit camp, he accepts Ashkenazi rule and preaches patience. To some extent, Shaul and David function as parts of one Mizrahi subject. Shaul is the father of Nahima's child, but does not take his place as father, though he is like a father to David, teaching him to treat racism with irony. Take it with a smile, as he says. David does precisely that, realizing that Shaul has become a father figure in a triangle of sorts with Tzipora. Shaul is hardly against success or hard work, but he is against engaging it as if being not Ashkenazi is a defect that can be overcome by success. Like Oedipus, David is using his intelligence to overcome the fate that has been cast upon him, by no fault of his own. As Alfred Bion pointed out, Oedipus falls because he is seeking to control destiny through the search for knowledge or education in this case. Shaul stands in for the missing father and against the mother, that is Tzipora, who is eventually rejected part of the parental state that tries to take the place of the father. And the paternal state is a whole thing we need to talk about. Shaul presents a pragmatic view of the world that accepts the real power of the state father to determine the conditions of life, while not identifying with the name of the father, precisely by rejecting the role, leaving Reuven as the name of the father. In the symbolic room, it is as if the lesson of Oedipus Rex has been learned, that what seems is not what is. Shaul teaches David to outsmart the symbolic father and prefer what is to what seems. On an allegorical level, it is prophetic, letting Ashkenazi hegemony play the paternal role, nursing a Mizrahi child, perhaps a future Orestes of sorts. It also returns to the question of masculinity. David contemplates his separation from Margalit, and he realizes that thinking of masculinity in terms of power was exactly the problem. The more he had it and used it as such, the more he became subjected to a real and symbolic system that rejected him. Shaul offers a view that is less binary. What would have Shaul done in my place? Act like a man, as Naima said? But what is the point in fierce resolution when the problem is deeper than resolute action? I stood facing a hostile world, alone against a compact force that threatened to pulverize me. I lived in a country controlled by a master race. Shaul saw things differently, finding solace in abstract solutions he formed for himself according to his character and individual perception. He didn't divide the world into two camps. Where I saw black against white, my brother saw all colors of the rainbow. In each segment he found worthy and unworthy people. Here perhaps is where he drew his power. Could I learn his way and implement it in my life? Clearly, masculinity is crucial to David's contemplation of the racialized reality. while suggesting that a so-called masculine approach is precisely the trap Tzipora prepares, and that he can only avoid by divorce. Such a model of masculinity is the familiar version of the will to power that seeks to unman the adversary. The model offered by Shaul is a multicultural and multidirectional non-binary, and it is very close to the kind of view Sami Michael elaborates in non-fiction books. David is trying to embrace Shaul's view, though the book tells the tale of his failure, at least until war comes and proves that true worth is not the same as the symbolic perceived worth, truly upending the Mizrahi stereotype. Moving from sexual desire to the political allegory, we see that the colony forces upon Oedipus the very question that Freud engages: to internalize the defeat of the father and accept the culture of the oppressor, or accept the father and rise against the oppressor. Oedipus in the transit camp moves from a libidinal struggle with the father towards the political allegory. As such, Oedipus is a warning against the faith of rulers in their culture and ability to understand reality, and a warning against our own benevolent reading. Mizrahi literature is not so much read as it is constructed to accommodate the Ashkenazi complex of Oedipal masculinity. Reading unstable and hypermasculinity when the Mizrahi subject is actually searching for its place. It is a political drama expressed also in sexuality, not the other way around. In the transit camp, and for Mizrahi literature, the state is Oedipus, and the father, symbolic or biological, is Tiresias telling the truth. Turning to the culture of the father is therefore not another form of Oedipal resolution, but rather the retrieval of prophecy against Oedipus in the state. It comes as no surprise that the chief adversary of Zionism turns out to be Jewishness itself, explaining something about Mizrahi politics in Israel. Zionist Ashkenazi literature is about Oedipus the colonized, while Mizrahi literature is of a post-colonial Oedipus. David, as a post-colonial Oedipus, defies Zionism's logic and does not blame the victim, but rather the oppressor. Zionism as an Ashkenazi state. David is quick to recognize the structure of power as well as the means to pass within it: education, war, and the possession of the Ashkenazi female. What he forces upon us is a double perspective. One is external, seeing conformity in all these so-called achievements. Another, internal perspective, would have them be more a fulfillment of what David actually is: a man and a Jew. Both position him in his inevitable side of the war and direct his heroic conduct. Oedipus in the transit camp is proud, but does not let his pride become his religion or downfall. He is more Antigone, sibling of kings, defying power by claiming the bodies, real and symbolic, that the state produces and reproduces with no end in sight. Thank you.
Okay, it's my pleasure to now introduce Dr. Shimoni, who I've actually already introduced. And she serves as a senior lecturer in the Department of Hebrew Literature at the Korean University, and also holds an additional appointment at the Haifa Academic College. Her research interests are diverse. They include immigration narratives, Mizrahi literature, the Holocaust of Mizrahi Jews, women in immigration, and Israeli identity politics. Particularly relevant to this conference is her book, Al Safa Geulah, Sipora Ma'ara, Dor Rishon V'Sheni, and the title of her talk today is War, Refuge, and Hospitality, an Identity Conflict in Sami Michael's work.
Refuge is a key issue in Sami Michael's work. As an activist in the communist underground, he himself had to find refuge in his relative's home before escaping to Israel. There are two forms of refuge in the Arabic culture that coincide with the Ridaz idea of hospitality. On the one hand is the dhimma, a religious concept established by Muslim Sharia law, regulating the status of non-Muslim citizens of Islamic states, primarily Jews and Christians. Dhimmis enjoy personal safety and religious freedom in return for paying a poll tax and meeting certain restrictions designed to signify their inferior status relative to the Muslim citizens of the state. In other words, while the dhimmi is given refuge and being secure, he is also required to adhere to a system of laws through which the sovereign makes it clear that he is the landlord. On the other hand, there is the Bedouin custom of hospitality. From the moment the guest enters a Bedouin home, he enjoys the protection of the household. The host tends to all his guests' needs and ensures his safety, even if his guest is his enemy. The Rida articulates the tension between these two types of hospitality as a poria between the ethical and political law of hospitality. I quote, "It is between these two figures of hospitality that responsibilities and decisions must in effect be taken. Doubtless, all ethics of hospitality are not the same, but there is no culture or social bond without the principle of hospitality. This principle demands a welcome without reserve and without calculation, an exposure without limit to whoever arrives. Yet, a cultural or linguistic community, a family, a nation, cannot not suspend, at the least, even betray this principle of absolute hospitality, to protect a home without doubt, to guarantee property and what is proper to itself against the ultimate unlimited arrival of the other." End quote. Derrida notes the irreconcilable inherent contradiction between the ethical law of hospitality, i.e. the unconditional acceptance of the guest, and the political law which sets boundaries and conditions. Under the ethical order, otherness is never put to the test of the other, is never put to the test, and the other is never required to reveal his identity. However, the political order sets boundaries, picks and chooses its guests, and demands that they account for their identity. Michael's work, and especially his novel Refuge, Chasut, illuminate the ethical and political intricacies embodied in the concept of hospitality. When the Yom Kippur War breaks out, Shula, a member of the Communist Party whose husband Morduk has gone to fight, is asked to harbor Fatri, a national Palestinian poet, against whom an arrest warrant has been issued. On the backdrop of the Sudden War, the national and personal tensions become heightened, raising difficult questions regarding national loyalty versus the communist ideology. The novel's plot unfolds over 4 days, Yom Kippur Eve and the first 3 days of the war, during which Fatri is a guest in Shula's home. However, the central refuge scene appears only midway through the novel. The novel opens with a lengthy description of Fatri and his cousin Watzfi's visit to the occupied territory. They are both Israeli Arabs who were uprooted from their land in the 48 war. Their identity has already been stained by the Israeli identity, as is evident when they come in contact with residents of the territories. Watzfi arrives at the home of his impoverished sister-in-law. His attitude towards her is a mirror image of the relationship between the Jewish regime and Israeli Arabs. The arrogant Watzfi arrives at the center of the wretched refugee camp as an occupier, driving a shiny American car. His presence stands out, defiant and masculine. He forcefully conquers his sister-in-law, leaving her mere crumbs of an inheritance to which she is in fact entitled by law. Watzfi is a guest who acts like a landlord. He forces his way in and upsets the household order. His conduct replicates and externalizes that of the Jewish regime after having conquered the territories. Watzfi is the product of an arrogant and oppressive regime and in order to survive it, he has had to imitate and adapt its behavior. Fatri is also stained by Israeliness, yet he resists it with all his might. He travels to the territories with the purpose of encountering himself anew, seeking to establish his Arab self, which was faded over decades of living among Jews. To this end, he seeks to meet with Zohir, the movement's leader and ideologist. Fatri hopes talking to Zohir will help rid him of the conflict he is burdened with. When the cousins arrive at the West Bank, Fatri changes into Western suit and tie. Watzke wonders why Fatri is putting on a costume, to which Fatri replies, "I am not putting on a costume, my friend, I am taking one off." He says he wants to dress like men like men his age living in the territories. "I don't want to look like an outsider in Jenin," he emphasizes. And yet, he is an outsider in the eyes of the locals who repeatedly mistake him for a Jew. The hospitality and acceptance he seeks are denied him. They keep seeing him as a hostile other. I have presented but a short description of what I consider to be the deep structure of the novel. The narrative offers a few variations of the relationships of refuge that raise some critical questions dealing with the essence of hospitality. Who is the host? Who is the guest? Who is the hostage? And how are those roles changing in accordance to the circumstances? At the heart of the novel stands, distilled and absolute, the ideal concept of refuge as Michael sees it. A man whose life is in danger stands at the doorway seeking refuge, totally at the mercy of the landlord. Around this core scene, the thin webs of loaded relationships within Israeli society are woven, all founded on the organizing principle of hospitality. The novel's central and explicit act of refuge is that provided by Shula to Fatri. This event beautifully reflects the clash noted by Derrida between the ethical and political laws of hospitality. Shula hesitates before agreeing to accept Fatri as her guest. Her situation is complex. Her husband is at the battlefront fighting the Arab enemy with whom Fatri identifies. Should she provide refuge to one who is both a friend and an enemy? Her dilemma is resolved only once she remembers Mordechai's account of the refuge he was granted when fleeing his persecutors. On one hand, she thinks that granting refuge to the Arab poet would be like firing a bullet in Mordechai's back. And on the other, Marduk, who was persecuted and spent so many years fleeing for his life, held the concept of refuge as sacred and considered it as a supreme value. Marduk arrived as a refugee from Iraq, where he spent 13 years in prison due to his activity in the communist underground. For him, the issue of refuge was formative and profound. It defined his identity and outlined the course of his life. But first comes the story of his refuge being denied. One night, while distributing pamphlets, he is almost caught. Suffering from aching teeth, hunger, and fatigue, he knocks at the door of his parents' house, stands at the threshold, and begs his father to let him in. The father, infuriated over his son's dangerous activity, denies his son's request. He bellows from the balcony for the policeman to come and catch the dangerous communist. The Jewish neighbors witness in astonishment as the father turns his son in, a Jew turning in another Jew. It is the Zionist neighbor of all people who grants Marduk refuge. I quote, "It ruined me," says Marduk. "I lifted my head up to my great and mighty father, towering above me, and I murmured, 'Father, Father,' and then I left." End quote. This is a symbolic moment of the death of the father and the loss of the home, a moment of utter rejection. The second time he is chased, he flees to his uncle's house, who takes him to the home of a distant relative, who takes him in without hesitation. A quote, as if she was happily sitting on her roof, just waiting for this cry for help, end quote. His experience of standing at the doorway, begging for help and being rejected on the one hand, as opposed to being totally accepted on the other, imprints Mordech with the ethical law of hospitality. This is what enables Shula to welcome Fatri into her home. She seeks to fulfill Mordech's ethical decree and offer Fatri absolute hospitality, welcoming him into her home without making any demands of him. Thus, for example, she goes out to buy him what he needs, beer and cigarettes, to make him feel comfortable, even if this involves going to a faraway supermarket, so as not to raise the suspicions of the local grocery store owner. She lies to a friendly neighbor, Tuvia, about the identity of her house guest, and most of all, she lets Patrick flirt with her. However, the balance is gradually broken, and the landlady loses control over her place in the household. When the poet seeks to take over her consciousness and her body, she feels threatened in his presence. She becomes his hostage. Quote, he wanted to come to her as an Arab man to a Jewish woman, demanding compensation for the injustice suffered by him and his people. And she did not believe she owed him anything. And later on, the poet did not want her as a refuge, but as a representative of a guilty people, end quote. Derrida develops the dialectic relation between host and guest. The host provides hospitality, but is also accepted by the guest, who agrees to the hospitality offered to him. In other words, the host is also a guest. However, Fatri does not consent to these rules of hospitality. He seeks to overturn the balance of power and become the landlord. The night before he leaves the house, he hears Arab radio broadcasts predicting Israel's defeat. He enters Shula's room, wake her from her slumber, and asks her to get ready to live with him. He seeks to grant her refuge. The battle over the home and the right to host lies at the heart of this faith, hospitality. What began as an innocent attempt to fulfill Mordech's ethical legacy turns into a hostile relationship in which the host becomes her guest's hostage. The host cannot be a true host, as she does not feel she is the true sovereign in her home, a necessary condition for being a host. Shula is conflicted between her affinity to national Zionism, expressed in her relationship with Rami, the love of her youth who represents nationalism, and the communist ideology evident through her relationship with her mother. This conflict undermines her sense of sovereignty over the home in both the real sense and mainly the symbolic national sense. Patri's stay in her home gives her a chance to clarify her positions. At a certain stage, she understands that her national affinity is greater than the guilt she has been forced to feel as a member of the communist organization. This is a festive moment of liberation. She decides to leave the organization and stand up to Fatri, rather than surrender to him. Gone is the fear that had characterized her relationship with him up to this point, and she feels free. This insight once again overturns the balance of power between host and guest. She is now the sovereign of her home, and he understands that he will not be able to regain control. He decides to leave. However, the story of political refuge I have presented here is not, to my opinion, the essence of the novel. Although Chasut seems to be a completely political novel, the true passion driving Michael is the reconstruction of the primordial utopian act of granting refuge. This scene, which was also described in A Handful of Folk, Professional Faith, contains several attributes. The loss of the father figure, the unconditional acceptance of the person taking refuge, as well as, and mainly, being accepted by a woman. All the refuge scenes include the female character who absolutely and unconditionally accepts the refuge seeker. Thus, for example, in Refuge, Mordech relays how, on the morning of his first day in his place of shelter, he awakes to see a cascade of black hair. Even before he sees the young woman's face, he knows he will fall in love with her. The memory of her smile and her acceptance accompany him throughout all his years in prison. In his Ode to Emmanuel Levinas, Derrida notes that the absolutely originary welcome, indeed the pre-original welcome, the welcoming per excellence, is feminine. All the elements of the scene point to the almost mythical, primeval aspect of the welcome offered to the other. In the novel Refuge, it is the welcome Shula offers Marduk. Marduk has emerged from the desert, a desert prison, at 30, mentally and emotionally beaten, and is a complete virgin when it comes to the relationship with the opposite sex. He marries the beautiful Shula, practically benefiting from the windfall, after her mother forces her to break up with Rami, the Zionist Tzabal, who has become a senior officer in the Armored Corps. Despite her love for Marduk, Rami's image lingers in her consciousness throughout the years of her marriage. The fact that Ido, Shula and Marduk's son, is born retarded attests to a distortion in the bond between the two. Marduk is worried of having another child, and of Shula it is said that her womb cries out for Rami. She believes that if she had had Rami's child, that child would not have been retarded. Even after 10 years of marriage, Shula and Marduk are somewhat alienated from one another. These elements indicating Shula and Marduk's problematic relationship hover in the background of the political refuge narrative, which appears to be central in the novel. However, a more in-depth look reveals quite the reverse. The refuge Shula grants Fatri is a mockery, as the simple fact is that Fatri is not facing any real danger. He arrives at Shula's home because he fears an administrative arrest warrant, a warrant that has not yet been issued against him. This appears even more farcical when compared to the fate of Fuad, another senior member of the Communist Party. Fuad, who does not go into hiding, appears at the police station twice a day. The officer notes that he has shown up and then sends him on his way. Aside from the humiliation this imposed, there is no real life-threatening danger with him. Furthermore, Patri's revolutionary power is represented as a person full of himself, and thus being depicted as somewhat pathetic. The text ridicules his position, whether directly, through Fuad's criticism, who despite Patri and his infertile poetry. It also criticizes him indirectly by emphasizing the heroicizing thoughts about himself. He is heroicizing thoughts about himself. 2 pages are devoted to the depiction of Patri's attempts to evaluate his military power. What is the value of his poetry? Is it comparable to a soldier, to a cannon, to a tank and its crew, to a battalion? But since he lacks military experience, he doesn't know what a battalion is. Eventually, he remembers once seeing a train carrying tanks, and his issues is resolved. He is equal to this train. The poet, and I quote, the poet was satisfied as if he had already struck the damned train whose weight is equal to a national court. Hence, the true refuge story lies in the intimate relationship between Shula and Mordechai. As mentioned, the type scene of ethical refuge in Michael's work always involves total acceptance by a woman. This acceptance undergoes a further modification here, related to being accepted by the womb, a metaphor for the ultimate form of refuge or hospitality. Pregnancy represents acceptance and welcoming of the unknown other into the innermost sanctum of the woman's body. Derrida identifies the concept of hospitality with a welcoming of the other, a central concept in the work of Levinas, who considered the other as more than his equal. I quote, "There is no symmetry between myself and the other. Rather, I need to consider myself subordinate to the other as his hostage. Hence, the subject is simultaneously host and hostage." And indeed, pregnancy, as a metaphor, contains these two aspects, that of total acceptance alongside the potential risk of violence which hosting always carries. To a large extent, Ido emerging retarded from Shula's womb is a testament for her rejection of Mordechai. It is worth noting that in several places in the text, the refuge Shula grants to Fatri is linked to a womb. However, every time this image appears, it is clear this is but a metaphorical or artificial possibility. Thus, for example, it is written that when Fatri arrives in the midst of the war, he enters a warm shelter or a nest. And elsewhere, it is explicitly stated that he is in an incubator. This is not the type scene of absolute refuge to which the author aspires. The facade of political refuge is but a cover for an issue of much deeper significance, universal yet local too, that of a woman accepting a man, and more poignantly, the white woman accepting the black man. The encounter between Shula and Fatri contains within it the present absence Marduk. His character does not actively participate in the novel's narrative present, but appears through monologues he voiced to Shula in the past. The refuge Shula offers Fatri disrupts the delicate system of balance in her life thus far, and she has to make some real choices. Up to this point, she has been controlled by her domineering mother and the strict rules of the Communist Party. Even her marriage to Marduk was planned by her mother, who refused to accept Rami as her son-in-law. She wanted an Arab-like man for her daughter, yet not an actual Arab. And Mordechai, the Mizrahi, fits the role perfectly. However, the fruit of this marriage, as I said, is a type of testament to the distortion inherent in this process. The interaction between Shula and Fatri during the few days of refuge enables the change in the intimate relationship between Shula and Marduk. The shift in Shula's consciousness is not merely a result of the hosting and external circumstances, but mostly due to the fact that during these days she discovers she is pregnant. This pregnancy was achieved through deception, as Marduk is afraid of having another retarded child. And while Shula fears of this pregnancy, it also represents her total acceptance of the others in her life, Marduk and Ido. This encapsulation of the issue of refuge, which reconstructs the ideal of total acceptance, sheds some interesting light on the relationship between the personal and political, the universals and the local in Michael's work. Being a realist, he deals with the complexity of the political situation, but out of understanding that it is a dead end. This could be the explanation for the way in which Fatri is portrayed. But being an idealist, or naive as we say, Michael chooses the human possibility as it represents the deep universal brotherhood between human beings, far beyond a categorization based on the politics of identities. By doing so, he remains true to the pure communist principle, advocating a discourse of human rights, which has served him as a constitutive principle since the early days of his social activism. Thank you.
The main topic that I wish to discuss in this lecture is the manner of closure in Sami Mikhail's novels. What is the meaning of the scenes of devastation and horrifying destruction, at times reaching the dystopical and macabre, at others recounting scenes of harrowing experiences? What is the place that this horrifying vision wishes to crush, or in other words, what place is asking to make its appearance and why? In answering that question, I would like first argue that the manner of closure in Mikhail's novels belong to a different order of existence, and they display sometimes even a prominent deviation from the realistic mode that characterized the books. This pattern of closure, where a single scene is intent to shift the whole weight of the book toward another horizon, is a dominant pattern of closure in Mikhail's writing. Hereby, I choose to apply Jacques Lacan's leading concept, name of the father, to the literary, geographical, and biographical structure, and argue that the name of the father is absent in Mikhail's literary works, both in the real sense, father-son relationship that appear in most of his books are problematic, as well as in the metaphorical sense. I will define name of the father as, and I quote, the basic indicator that allows meaning to take its natural course. This fundamental indicator gives the subject identity, name, a place in the symbolic order, end of quotation. I would like to argue that a certain scenario model, a model that denotes harsh physical suffering, is a pivotal scenario in the volume of Mikhail's literary work. This scenario is present outright in varying forms, both in his early work, Refuge Chasut, and in his last book, Diamond from the Desert, Yahalom Min HaYeshimon, but also makes many appearances in other books by Mikhail. I seek to interpret this scenario through Freudian and Lacanian viewpoints, and to tie it to the loss of the name of the father, and to reach a comprehensive conclusion regarding the above initial question. These physical scenarios stand in symbolic equivalence to what I call a tortured place, a concept which adjoins several spheres of discussion: the psychoanalytical, the physical, and the geographical. The tortured place is Mikhail's spatial paradigm, and the harsh yet magnificent presentation of this place is the distinct form of closure in Mikhail's novel. The tortured place is a place where tortured people gather. It is a place which lacks a consensual name of the father, a place where the individuals who represent the primary level of social bond, the family, fail to adhere to the same real and symbolic father, and thus bring on the destruction of this organic unit. This market discourse, which binds together the destruction of values and physical bodies and dares to probe the consequences of touching evil, transport us to a particular form of literature called Holocaust literature. In several essays that I've written, I've discussed the complicated tie between Eastern Mizrahi literature and Holocaust literature. Here are two examples: the bare existence, harsh and devoid of all meaning, described by Aaron Appelfeld, and the dystopical, black Kabbalistic poetry of Moshe Sartal in my book, Living Within a World. The sense of spatial ruthlessness, the obsessive need for walking and wandering, also found both in porcelain poetry and Sami Verdugo prose. In brackets, I would add the Palestinian literature, a thing that creates a triangle perspective which hold the three traumas that shaped and are shaping Israel today. Finally, I would like to show that this poem Michael's prose, meaning the bitter portrayal of injustice, without embracing a counterbalancing ideology or teleology, bears deep significance for us Israelis at this specific point in time. Firstly, I will examine the manner of closure in Michael's novels, All Men Are Equal, but Some Are More, Shovim Shovim Yoter, that tells the story of inequality between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews in Israel. The hero of this novel is passing through traumas, war, and pain, and the book closes in his word, and I quote, "Actually, my life has been full of fears since my youth. I skip. For the first time in my life, I feel like a worthy citizen whose skin color ceases to be an issue, a physical deformity. True, I had to go through the inferno of war and relegate my wife, my love, to another man. For that to happen, can I live with that? Only time will tell." A handful of folk, Chofet Shel Arfel, ends with the separation of the two lovers, Ramzi and Suham, when Ramzi flees to Iran. Its concluding sentences say, "Farewell, Suham," he said. With a surprised smile, she realized that she hasn't moved at all. Her own hand pulled the door behind her to close it. End of quotation. In Refuge, an intimate moment when Fatri, the Arab poet, worries over Shula because he thinks that Israel is going to lose a battle, turns sore. A very acrid chord marks the closure for Victoria in the novel Victoria, and I quote, "A girl in a well-ironed robe stood waiting, grinning maliciously. Victoria lifted her head up in a bitter pride. Why not a man? She was thinking to herself, at this very moment, a young girl like this one is cheating her out of her love. The elevator wasn't working. She grabbed the stair rail and walked down carefully, pained by her arthritic legs. A ghostly headache was hooking at her brain. She was afraid to let go of the rail and felt too embarrassed to sit on the stairs and search in her purse for her high blood pressure pill. She might start crying or find it too difficult to stand up again. On the ground floor, she faced another very long, shiny corridor." End of quotation. Trumpet in the Valley ends in the death of its hero, Alex, in the First Lebanon War, and with Huda's pregnant dilemma of raising a child who will always be an Arab among Jews or a Jew among Arabs. Mayim Moshkim Lamayim ends with a death-like scene when Joseph is trapped in a water well and almost died there. Nabila, Yonim Betrofalga, ends with the murder of Karim and Zeev Epstein at the hand of an agitated Arab mob. Aida ends in a cruel scene where the houses of Zaki friends are deliberately set on fire and all who live there lose their lives. A diamond from the desert ends in this word, and I quote, "Just like that, just like that." The words crushed on the tip of her tongue. "You divorced her and gave up on your son as well, just like that." Why do you think I gave up on him? Father once dreamt that he will be a king. It was before he got pneumonia. Now he has a grandson who is a prince in America, thanks to a girl he always regarded as unworthy, as someone fit only for the city's backyard. Regina was frozen in her seat, but her lips were throbbing. "You mock yourself and us. Such mockery is poison, Kamal." "I know, Mother." End of quotation. What is the meaning of such devastation? What does a dystopical vision of a shaky world drowning in bitterness or deep sorrow signify? For a moment, I will put aside this question and study a scene from the novel Refuge that you have already heard. One of the characters in the book is Mother, who was a communist in Iraq and now a soldier fighting in Yom Kippur War. He appears in the book only through his wife's memories, and she recalls his tales. Although he seems to be only a minor character, Mother carries a significant weight. This comes from the fact that he clearly mirrors actual autobiographical events from Michael's biography, such as taking part in the communist struggle in Iraq, being captured, and forced to flee to Israel. The story that stands out the most is that of Marduk being tortured in the Iraqi prison as a result of his communist activities. Marduk tells his story twice. First, he tells Shula, his wife, about his torture because he wishes to be the guilt bearer for the birth of their retarded son. He blames it on the burns he has suffered, and I quote, "The strange nose that I heard behind me was that of a paraffin stove. They put it under the iron chair that I was tied to." End of quotation. This torture scene is told for the second time, and I quote, "But Chanchal made two grave mistakes. First, he wanted to hurt me as a Jew. So while I was trapped there, struggling to breathe, Chanchal delivered his monologue. Screw his mother, Jewish creep, son of a bitch, nice kid. And then he made his second mistake. He went for me with the stove and the iron chair. As my voice became hoarse with screams and my senses dimmed, I knew that what's coming after is going to be pure torture. I wished for a quick death, and he wished a prolonged one." End of quotation. This story about modern horrific torture by fire reminds us of Freud's famous analysis of a dream named "Father, can't you see I'm burning?" In his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud discusses this dream at length. The dream goes like this. A father is sitting day and night by his dying son's bed. After the son passes away, the father lies down in the next room, but leaves the door open so that he can look into the room and see his son's dead body lying in the casket, surrounded by tall candles. Later on, the father has a dream in which his son is standing at his bed, grabbing his arm and whispering accusingly, "Father, can't you see I'm burning?" The father wakes up, looks at the other room, and realizes that the candles have fallen and his boy's dead body is on fire. Freud's interpretation contends that the dream holds a father wishful thinking that his son is alive, as in actually warning him. The father refuses to wake up in time to face the bitter truth. Jacques Lacan, on the other hand, has a different interpretation. The father actually wanted to wake up quickly because denial has room only in reality. The dream's content became too volatile, and thus the father hastened to awaken from his sleep. In the Freudian interpretation, the desire is not to be awakened. And in the Lacanian interpretation, the desire just the opposite, to be awakened. This place, situated between the desire to be awakened and the desire not to be awakened, between dream and bitter reality, emerges in Michael's closures. All through his books, Michael's prose carries a definite realistic quality, but at least three final scenes raises a question whether the closures are realistic or exaggerated. Alex's death in the war, Huda's new situation as a pregnant widow, the stoning of the two brothers, an Arab and a Jew, the burning of the two houses and their inhabitants, Aida, גם בספרים נוספים. Are these realistic closures compatible with the mode of the story that we were accustomed to? In my opinion, this unusual closure bears dreamlike characteristics. In this manner, Michael's prose adhere to both interpretations. The closing scene suggests a wish come true, the wish to destroy the existing order. And at the same time, it is a wake-up call for us, the readers, to face reality and take part in changing it. Now, if we introduce the concept of name of the Father to the current situation and review the scene from Refuge, we find that Chanchal, the ultimate inquisitor, failed to recognize the appropriate name of the Father that will truly hurt Marduk or break his spirit. Calling Marduk a Jew does not affect him because he is already immune to such slander, and I quote from the Roman. Chanchal's mistake stems from his ignorance. He is not aware that a new Jew already exists or merely is in denial of his existence. End of quotation. But who is this Father that Marduk is calling to? Not God, not his real father or his communist comrade, nor the belief in the state's potential for enlightenment, for he eventually lives it. The real question here is, does this name of the Father even ever exist for Marduk, Michael? Another variation of this torture scene is found in Diamond from the Desert. Escaping the rabbi's bashings in the Jewish cheder, the father sends his son to the cheder as a form of punishment. Here too, the link between the son's total desertion of his father's values, apparent in the final scene of the book that I've quoted before, and his physical desertion to torture is obvious. At the beginning of my lecture, I've pointed out the link between Mizrahi literature and Holocaust literature. This brings to mind Jean Amery, as he appears in his book Beyond Guilt and Forgiveness. In this book, Amery examines at length the ordeal of his torture at the hand of the Gestapo. Regarding the individual undergoing torture, he writes that, I quote, as he received his first blow, he loses something, which momentarily we will call trusting the world. End of quotation. But is torture the reason for losing the name of the Father, or had the name of the Father been lost even before the torture? It seems that a permanent theme in Michael's text is the process of losing the name of the Father in all its aspects. Long before the torture scene in Refuge, we find this scene that we've heard before. Father, I whispered through the closed door separating us. Father, open up. The cops are after me. They will be here soon. Father, open the door. I'm not well. I skipped. Suddenly I heard the balcony door opening above me and my father stepped out. For some reason, he looked huge to me. He shouts, policeman, come get him. He's here, the communist criminal. Thus, the answer to the question of the child in Freud's dream, / to Marduk question, / and to Michael question, Father, can't you see I'm burning? Is, yes, I see, but I don't care. This imagined two-line dialogue captured in a nutshell a profound feature of Michael's prose. In All Men Are Equal But Some Are More, the same question, Father, can't you see I'm burning, is directed at the state, who sees its Mizrahi Jews burning. In Abila, we see Palestinian and Jews killing and being killed, and the cry is directed toward the political leaders of the two nations. Victoria and Diamond from the Desert cry out for women. A handful of folk rages over poverty and its losing battle. And Aida manifests the cry for modern Iraq that is literally on fire. In his book, Did You Know the Land Where Lemon לא סומה ידעת את הארץ שם לימון פורח, יגאל שוורץ defines two utopical spaces, the utopia of the garden and the utopia of the city, and gives an analytical overview of the novels which conduct an interesting dialogue with these concepts, such as The Love of Zion, Ahavat Zion, that was mentioned by Avraham Apu, or such variation by Moshe Shamir and Amos Oz. With this model in mind, Michael paints in his novel a space whose integral parts seemingly achieve harmony, but the last scene at the end rips apart the delicate stitches that held it all together, and its ingrained flaws are exposed. The loss of the name of the father is a fundamental characteristic of many of Michael's novels. Yet, I would like to argue that this boundless space, which lacks a disciplinary narrative, holds new thought options for us. It is a kind of literature that does not direct us towards the obvious and the existing order of things, but gives us the opportunity to rethink ourselves. Chaviva Pedaya writes in her book Time and Place, and I quote, "For the Jews, the loss of the land of Israel meant a hole in the symbolic fabric of things, the very definition of diaspora. But defining salvation as a cure for diaspora and closure this hole obsessively could be very dangerous." End of quote. Michael's works aim to rescue us from the prevailing modus of obsessively closing the hole and leave us in the boundless empty space where something new can grow out from the tortured place. Thank you.
You allowed us to feel from up close your works and great mind and spirit. Many thanks to you, my dear colleagues, for your illuminating in-depth papers. We hope, Eli and me, we can publish them in a collection. אנחנו נעשה את זה ישיבות ברומא נצליח. Many thanks to our Northwestern partners, Eli, Nancy, Gregory ודיאן, for your wonderful hospitality. אני חושב שכולם...
So the procedure would be that I will ask the question in English, Sami will answer in Hebrew, and Nancy was gracious enough to help me out by translating Sami's comments, which will be short into English. Thank you so much, Nancy. So Sami, מסגרת הזמן the framework, 15 minutes for all together. Is this good? 20 minutes? Nafil, but I have a question first. I know you're eager to start. So Sami, for almost 2 days we have been discussing you, analyzing your work, comments, observations, before and after, this aspect of your writing, that aspect of your writing. My question to you, Sami, what does it all do to you? What do you feel? How do you react?
I understood the question.
חברות עשירות שלוקחות כל שנה את העובדים הבכירים שלהם לבדיקות רפואיות. חברות עשירות שולחות את העובדים הבכירים שלהם לבדיקה רפואית כל שנה.
So he's talking about the wealthy companies that have full medical checkups every year.
ואני לא שייך לשום חברה עשירה.
He doesn't belong to any wealthy company such as that.
אבל יש לי רופאים שגם קוראים, רופאים שהם ידידים שלי.
But I have doctors who read and who are my friends.
ומדי פעם הם קוראים לי לבדיקה כללית.
Sometimes they call me, they invite me for a complete general checkup.
הבדיקה האחרונה הייתה לפני כמה חודשים, עליתי על הרכב, רחל ליוותה אותי כמו אריה, אני הולך לבית החולים לבדיקות.
So I went to one just a few months ago, and Raquel took me, and I had various checkups and tests.
מיד מלבישים לי, כשאני מגיע לבית חולים, את החלוק של החולים,
They give me that lovely robe to wear at the hospital. You know, the one that,
מסביבי, הסטטוסקופ עומדים מסביב, הם נעשים גדולים ואני נעשה קטן.
so it's as if they are big and they become bigger and bigger with their stethoscopes and so forth, and I in that little scanty robe become smaller.
בהתחלה אני בא בתחושה שאני עייף, קצת בריא, על אף הגיל של 89.
I feel like I come as a nice, a strong, big, healthy lion, even though I'm 89.
תוצאת הבדיקה היא שיש לי בעיות בכליות. יש לי תפקוד לא נכון, לא משנה באיזה.
So I feel at the end of when I get the results, I have these problems and those problems not so important, which is that one.
העורק השמאלי שמוביל למוח 80% סתום.
This is 80% closed, this particular artery or vein.
השנייה היא על הפנים.
The second is even worse.
אני צריך ניתוח כדי לדבר על הצמיחה של העין.
So I need an eye operation.
לסיכום, אני אומר תמיד לרחל, אני באתי לבית חולים אריה, יוצא ממנו עכבר.
I came to the hospital as a lion. I left as a mouse.
משהו כזה קרה לי.
Something like that happened to me.
אני אומר הממזרים,
I say these mamzerim.
כל אחד מוח חריף,
Everyone has a sharp mind.
והם מבינים את הספרים שלי יותר ממני.
And they, of course, they understand my books better than I do.
זו התרשמות שלי. ואני אומר, אולי הם יתחילו לכתוב ואני אבקר אותם.
So maybe they should write and I should investigate them and study them.
אבל אני חייב.
But I was,
חביבה נתנה לי, עשתה לי השוואה שבאמת זה רב. ג'אהר, ההשוואה ביני לבין הג'אהר. זה כמו, בתרבות הערבית זה כמו שייקספיר בתרבות האנגלית.
so Khalida has done an incredible thing for me, a great compliment when she compared me to Al-Jahid. Al-Jahid in Arabic culture is as if it's Shakespeare plus.
דורות של סופרים ערבים ינקו ממנו.
Generations of Arabic literatures have taken from him and learned from him.
תרבות הערבית כמו התרבות היהודית היא תרבות של שירה.
The Arabic cultural tradition, like the Hebrew cultural tradition or Jewish, is a culture of poetry.
והוא כתב פרוזה מדהימה.
And he wrote amazing prose.
לבוא להשוות את איתו, האמת, התחלתי להתנפח עם הדברים כמו צפדיה.
So by comparing me to him, it really has helped puff me up. He's getting back to the lion stage.
חיפשתי מהר מאוד סיגה לנפץ את הבלון שהתנפח.
So in just shortly, the frog or toad's stomach will be burst.
אז התחלתי לנתח השם של ג'חד. הג'חד בשפה הערבית זה אדם עם עיניים בולטות.
So he said he was thinking about the name of Al-Jahid, and Al-Jahid is actually a nickname for the literary figure, and it means the bug eye.
אז אני תיארתי את עצמי שהיא נתנה מחמאה על המחמאה שיש לעיניים בולטות ככה שאני לא יכול להתחיל אותו
So she's given me such a compliment. I feel like my eyes have become so full and bug-eyed that I can't even wear my glasses.
האמת היא תחושה שלי לאורך כל הימים האלה, ואתם מנתחים, נותנים מחמאות, ומרקים עליי מילים של עדות.
So over the past few days, and years, you've given me so many compliments, and you have analyzed my work and discussed my work, critiqued my work positively.
האם זה באמת שהכתיבה שלי כל כך טובה?
Is my writing really that good?
ואני באמת, יש לי ספר כזה גדול.
And do I have really that much intelligence?
כל הזמן ילדים אמרו לי, אתה לא מאמא, לא אבא, זה לא ככה, תמיד תקנו, כל השפה העברית.
My kids had always said, no, you're wrong, this isn't right, and you did this wrong, and so forth, and yet.
אז תרשו לי לומר שאני לפחות, אני אקבל מכם 10% מהמחמאות.
So I'm going to take 10% of the compliments.
ואני באמת מודה לכם.
And I very much, truly and sincerely, very much thank you all.
אני תמיד אומר, הספר הכי טוב שלי זה הספר שעוד לא כתבתי.
I always say that my very best book is the book I have not yet written.
אולי בגיל 90 בזכותכם אני אכתוב עוד רומן.
Maybe at the age of 90, because of you, I will write another novel.
סמי, זו בדיוק השאלה הבאה שרשומה אצלי.
So that's exactly my next question.
עד עכשיו דיברנו על אהבה, על חווה כהנא.
Until now, we talked about the past.
מה הספר הבא? מה התוכניות לעתיד?
What's your next book? What are your plans for the future?
האמת, אני מים נושקים למים, 20 שנה עברתי.
So his book, Water Kissing Water, that he worked on for, he says 20 years, but it was actually more.
שווים ושווים יותר אני אדבר, כי אני הבטחתי שאני אדבר עליו, כי יצירה ראשונה שלי לקח לי 25.
So equal and more equal took me 25 years, and I promised I would talk
עכשיו
about this in
אני
the first book.
גמרתי כתיבה של שני רומן.
So now I finished the writing of 2 books, 2 novels.
שאלה אני אזרוק אותם, אכתוב אותם מחדש.
Should I throw them away? Should I write them both from, rewrite them, revise them?
אני 7 שנים קודם אותם.
7 years I'm writing them.
או אני אבחר אחד מהם ואעבד אותו עוד 3 שנים.
Or should I take one of them and work on it for the next 3 years?
עכשיו נדבר על הספר.
So let's talk about the first book.
הרהוט הכתיבה שלי הראשון במדינת ישראל, הרהיטים, שאני ישבתי על 2 בלוגים בשולחן הכתיבה, היו 5 בלוגים.
So he's talking about the first furnishings of writing, his first writing furniture were blocks. So the desk was 5 blocks and the chair was 2 blocks.
ב3 שנים שאני הייתי בארץ, אני חושב שזה ב-53 גמרתי לכתוב רומן, בשפה ערבית.
So after 3 years, I finished writing a book. It was in Arabic. 3 years of being in Israel.
אחרי חודשיים היה, איך אומרים, כנס של המפלגה הקומוניסטית.
And so 2 months later, there was a gathering of the Israeli Communist Party.
והוכרז שבסיום הכנס יעניקו פרס ראשון ליצירה ספרותית ערבית או עברית.
So it was declared at the conference that they would give a prize to the best writing, either in Hebrew or in Arabic.
ואני ברוב חוצפתי, רק 3 שנים אני בארץ, כתבתי רומן על ישראל. והגשתי.
So I presented my work that I had written after being in Israel only 3 years. I had written it about being in Israel.
היו, בתחרות הזאת השתתפו קרוב ל-20 סופרים יהודים וערבים ילידי הארץ.
There were at least 20 Jewish and Arab writers who took part in this competition, some of whom were
ודווקא הרומן שלי קיבל פרס ראשון.
and my novel got the first prize.
הפרס הראשון הוא 20 תמונות של סטלין בפוזות.
So the first prize was 20 pictures of Stalin, portraits of Stalin,
והדפסת הספר בשתי שפות.
and publication of the book in 2 languages, Arabic and Hebrew.
זה היה ב-1957.
That was in 1953.
ואחרי שנה ככה, נו, איפה אתם עושים את העבודה, מדפיסים? אמרו, תחכה, עוד אנחנו מכינים, ויש שם את זה.
And a year later, asking them, what's going on with the book, and are you publishing it? Yes, wait.
הגיע לשנת 1955,
Now in 1955,
והיו הגילויים על הזוועות של סטלין.
and there are all the problems with Stalin and the...
אני החלטתי ביום הרביעי לעזוב את המפלגה הקומוניסטית.
I decided to leave the Communist Party.
בימים ההם לא היו טלפונים בכל בית, לי לא היה.
In those days, you'll remember, there weren't telephones in every house.
אבל על ידי שליח קיבלתי הודעה, סמי מיכאל, אנחנו מבשרים לך שבחודש הבא נדפיס לך את הרומן.
So I got a message through Messenger that Sami Michael, within next month, we are going to publish your novel.
סופר צעיר, בגיל צעיר, מבשרים לו שהולכים להדפיס לו את הרומן.
So picture a young writer at the beginning of his career. He is told that they are going to publish his novel.
בוודאי הוא יקפוץ בשמחה.
Obviously, that person would jump for joy.
אני לא קפצתי,
But Sami did not jump.
כמעט בכי.
He almost cried.
הוצאתי 300 עמודים בכתב יד שנכתבו על שולחן של 5 בלוגים.
I took the 300 pages that I written by hand on those 5 blocks.
לקחתי חבילות של 10 דפים,
I took like 10 pages at a time,
קראתי את כל הספר
and I ripped the entire book
וזרקתי את זה להשפעה.
and threw it in the trash.
כי כבר התכנים של הספר לא התאימו למסקנות שאני הגעתי אליהן.
Because the content of the book no longer matched the conclusions to which I had reached.
הגיבור של עאידה לא היה עושה את זה,
The hero of Aida would not have done that,
אבל אני עשיתי.
but I did.
ואיפה התשובה של מי ביקש ממני להגיד מה הספר הראשון?
So this is the answer to the person who asked me about my first book.
הספר הזה קפץ כנראה מהפח אשפה, כתבתי מחדש, ויצאו שנים ושנים.
And that book somehow jumped out of the trash, and 20 years later, I wrote it as Shavim Shavim, more and more equal and more equal.
הצעתי לכל סופר צעיר, שלא יהסס לקרוא מה שלא נדמה לו שזה השימוש.
So this is advice for any young writer. Don't hesitate to rip up anything that you don't think.
אני חושב שכבר סרקתי כל הזמן.
בסדר, כמה זמן שאתה רוצה.
אין לו שאלה, אולי באמת יש לי עוד משהו שזה בוער בעצמותיי לומר.
So I have one more thing that I really have to say.
שירתי בצבא כחייל יחיד ללא משפחה.
I served in the army as a lone soldier.
וכל המחנה בעצם היו אנשים, נערים, בחורים בגילי, ניצולי שואה ללא משפחות.
And most of the people I was serving with were young men who were survivors of the Holocaust, also without their families.
עבדתי בתיקון טנקים שם, זה היה התפקיד שלי.
I worked on tanks, that was my job.
נשבר לי לעסוק בשמנים ובלכלוך ובזוהמה.
I couldn't stand working with the oils and the preparation, fixing and preparing the tanks.
הלכתי למפקד המחנה ואמרתי לו מה המצוקה שלי, אני צריך מזון רוחני.
And I said to the officer in charge, I can't do this anymore. I really need some sort of intellectual nourishment.
הואיל והוא גם כן היה ניצול שלו.
He was also a survivor of
הוא
the
מאוד
Holocaust.
נחמד אליי. אחרי 5 ימים הוא אומר לי שבירר בהסתדרות ופתחו קורס לספרות העברית בתל אביב.
So he was very nice, and he went and he found out that there was a course on Hebrew literature in Tel Aviv.
והוא על חשבונו, הוא שילם את הכסף.
And he himself paid for the course.
והלכתי, כשהגעתי לעולם של הרצאות, משהו זה 20 מטר מרובעים,
And I went to the hall of to the place where the lecture was being held. It was maybe 20 square meters.
נכנסה אישה תמירה,
And then
כולה הדר והקרינה אור,
a tall,
בושה, שמלה שחורה, ואמרה אני לאה גולדברג.
and Leah Goldberg entered, a very impressive woman who was wearing a black dress suit. Very impressive. She entered and said, I am Leah Goldberg.
אומרת, אנחנו נעבור קורס, נלמד את מנדלי מוכר הספרים.
And in this course, we're going to study Mendel Mocher Sfarim, Mendel the bookseller.
אבל אני חייבת לתת הסבר.
But I must give an explanation, she said.
זה לא סופר שיליד הארץ,
This is not a native Israeli writer,
וזה לא חי במדינת ישראל,
and he didn't live in the state of Israel,
מת מזמן.
and he's died a while ago.
ואז נתנה עוד הסבר, כמעט שרף לי את הלב.
And she gave another explanation, more background that almost,
והדברים האלה של שנות ה-53,
this is 1953,
אמרה פה בארץ, אחרי הניצחון המוחץ של מלחמת השחרור,
she said in the state of Israel after the glorious victory of 1948,
הסתכלו על הגולה מלמעלה.
that they looked at the diaspora, the outside of the state of Israel,
משום שבגולה,
from above.
משום שהובילו אותם כצאן לטבח.
As if they had taken the Holocaust victims as a flock sheep to be slaughtered.
אז הגולה פסולה.
So the diaspora was as if had been canceled.
וגם כל היצירה הספרותית של הגולה גם פסולה.
And as if all of the great literary works of the diaspora were also no longer of value.
אז רציתי להיות סופר אשכנזי וכתוב על הגולה האשכנזית.
So at that moment I wanted to be an Ashkenazi writer and write about the Ashkenazi diaspora.
אז במקום זה כתבתי על הספרים.
So instead of that, I wrote about it.
תודה רבה.
Thank you very much.
סמי, מילה אחרונה. אני חושב שבשם כולם, מה שאנחנו יכולים לאחל לך זה קודם כל אריכות ימים ובריאות טובה, ועוד הרבה ספרים מן הסוג הזה שאנחנו יומיים כבר דנים בהם. תודה רבה.
So Eddie wants to say a last word, and he wants to congratulate Sami Michael and to wish him a long life and many wonderful works, and thank you very much.
תודה רבה שוב על המארגנים, היוזמים, וגם על האורחים שבאו ולא פירקו ולא נרתמו, אלא גם נהנו מדברי החוכמה ששמענו.
Thank you to everybody who was involved in the organizing and the thinking of this, and also to all the guests and everybody who stayed awake and was here. And
ולסיום אני אומר שבזכות ידידי כאן ציפר, שידלו חי, שידלו את מה ברשת ב' על הכנס היום.
And he wants us to mention that because of Benny Ziffer's great works, there was also mention of the conference, or more than mention of the conference, on Reshet Bet in Israel in a live broadcast.
תודה רבה לכם.
Thank you very much.